All right, welcome back. And today we're going to take a look at a really important aspect of photography, and that is composition. Now, composition is made up of a whole bunch of different rules. However, you don't always have to use all the rules for composition. Sometimes you use one, sometimes you can use them all, sometimes you can just use a few. It really is dependent on you. So today we're going to take a look at some of the compositional rules in photography, and really these are in art in general. So years ago, mathematicians were trying to find out what is beauty. And they came up with this formula: A plus B is to A as A is to B. And I think if you told that formula to 95% of the people in the world, they would have no idea how to use that as a compositional element in photography. But what we need to know here is when they did the math for this equation, it comes out to 1.61. So remember the 1.61. We're going to come over here to Fibonacci's spiral, also known as Fibonacci's number. In this case, they were doing sort of the same thing, but they were looking in nature for what is beautiful and trying to identify that. And if you do the math on Fibonacci's spiral, guess what? It comes up to 1.61, just like it does in the golden ratio. The issue with this is it's just way too complicated for the average person to apply to an image in photography. So what we did is change the 1.61 to rule of thirds, meaning you can just divide an image up into thirds, and that made it a lot easier for the average person to use in photography. So let's go ahead and let's come up here to this image here. Now I'm going to click on the crop tool, and then I'm going to click inside, and up comes our rule of thirds. So this is a third, this is a third, this is a third, this is a third. The idea of rule of thirds is at these crosshairs is where your subject should be. Here, 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 here. However, sometimes depending on what you're shooting, it could be on this line, on this line, on this line, on this line. For instance, imagine if this was a landscape and a horizon was on this line. So you would have a third here, 2/3 there. It does not always have to be at the crosshairs. And in my case, I'm not a huge fan of always placing things right here on these crosshairs. Sometimes because of image balance, I'm shifting it this direction, not usually to the right, but in towards the center a little bit. And we'll go over that and cover it in a little bit. So let's come up here. We can also take a look at some other things. So we can come down here and take a look at the golden ratio. So this is our golden ratio. This would be 1.61. And you can see it's very similar. And what happens, I think, a lot of times when I'm using rule of thirds and the lines over here, and I say it lacks balance, the image needs to be in the center, I'm really, in my mind, switching to the golden ratio, and I'll show you that if an image comes up, and we might even be able to use this one. We can also take a look at this same image cropped in a little bit with rule of thirds. So rule of thirds being really close, though we're going to come into the edge a little bit. We'll put our subject there, and bam, just like that, we're using those rule of thirds. This type of an image is what we call asymmetrical, meaning it's off to the side. We'll take a look here in a little bit at the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical. All right, the next subject that I want to talk about is dominance. And in art, we need a dominant subject. If we look at these two green tomatoes, you'll notice that both tomatoes fill the frame, and both tomatoes are exactly about the same size. So we don't know if this image is about this tomato or this tomato. Well, why? Because there's no dominant tomato in the image. So if we come over here and we take a look at the flower, in this image we have a flower here, the start of a flower here, and a big flower here. Because this image is large, we know that this is the dominant aspect of this image. Just like if we go to these dogs, just like the tomatoes, there's two dogs. There's a dog here and a dog here. Well, we've got two factors here. One, this is larger, And it's also in focus, and the photographer saying, hey, this is the important part of this image. So I want this to be the dominant aspect. In photography, you need a dominant subject. All right, in this next group of images, we can do two things. We're going to look at the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical and leading lines, also known as convergence lines and perspective. All right, if we take this image and we were to draw a line straight down the center, we will know that what is on this side is a mirror image of what is on this side. This is what we call symmetrical in composition. If we have something where the subject is on one side but not a mirror image or centered, this is what we call asymmetrical, meaning it's off center, whether to this side, down here, up here. It doesn't make a difference, but it's not centered and it's not the same on both sides. You'll find that most images are going to be asymmetrical versus symmetrical. All right, so let's come up here and take a look at this image. In this image, we have a symmetrical image. Like if we draw this line straight, what we see basically over here is almost an exact replica of what we have over here. We are also using what we call leading lines. So this line that goes from here all the way to the back and would meet into a point back here, because this is our subject. This is where those leading lines are taking us. So every one of these lines eventually leads back to this point right here. And you can use any of them in this image. We use that to lead our viewer through an image. In photography, you're using compositional elements, you're using light, and where you focus to lead your viewer to a specific area or lead them through an image in a specific way. We're not leaving it up for the viewer to do that on their own. We want to compose the image so that the viewer moves through the image and lands at the dominant part of it exactly how we want them to see it. So in this image, notice that we have an asymmetrical composition. So I will click on the crop symbol right here. And if I click in here, you'll see, right, we've got this road ending on this third. So this is an asymmetrical composition. The line is moving us through and back here in this image. And essentially, this should be on the bottom third. Is it perfectly on the bottom third? No. Can I adjust it? Yes. So if I was to come in here and adjust this, basically what we want is this grassy area to be a third and this to be 2/3. Or you could do the opposite where you would have a third of the sky and 2/3 of the ground. I tend to like the opposite other one, where it's usually a third of the ground and 2/3 of the sky, but that's just me. There's no right or wrong way to do that. We'll go ahead and hit escape and get out of that. But in this case, we're using leading lines and the lines are leading us back through our image, and we're using an asymmetrical composition. All right, the next item we're going to take a look at here is what we call repetition. Now, just like in music that has an underlying beat and a pattern, we can use repetition in photography. And so we're going to use that idea of repetition in this image of photography. Now, remember, just because you have a rule or an element of composition doesn't always make it a great composition. Is this a really great image? No, there's lots of issues with it. But it's a good example of repetition, which is a rule in composition. So in this case, we have one element here, and then it gets bigger, but it's still very similar. It gets bigger, it gets bigger, it gets bigger. So this is repetition used in photography. Let's take a look at another image. If you look here, we have our leading lines, and those lines are leading us straight across here. We're following these lines. The bikes are following those lines, and we move in this image from left to right as we follow the people on the bikes and the scooters through the image. We also have repetition because we have 1, 2, 3 elements in this photo, and we follow that through. The last thing we're going to do is take a look at these tulips. All right, in this image, we're repeating our flowers. Now, before we looked at it, it was very easy to follow because it was 1, 2, 3. It was very linear. In this case, the flowers are scattered all over our image, but there is a pattern where we have the vertical stalk and the flower, and they shoot up, and we follow them across the image and then back as they fade out. And this is using repetition as a compositional element in photography. In this next compositional element, we're going to take a look at positive space, negative space, and something that I call dead space, which is basically too much negative space. So if we come and hover over this cat, the computer is going to make a selection. The cat is our subject, and that is going to be our positive space. If I select the cat, it will make a selection. I could fill that selection with black. So we can go to Edit, Fill, Black. That's our positive space. And now if I inverse that to select everything but the cat, and I fill that area with white, that is going to be our negative space. So in this case, we have the cat, which is the positive space, and the white, which is our negative space. What we're using this negative space is to hold or put like a buffer around our negative space. And a lot of times you're going to hear me talk about this image doesn't have enough negative space. The subject is too close. So if we cut off this and had the cat right here, well, there's not enough negative space around this image. So we're using this negative space to surround this cat, and it kind of holds it in its bubble, and it helps us focus the cat and land on its eyes so we just see the subject. Now, this works really well because it's simple and clean. If you have a busy or a textural pattern in the background, it can distract. So just because you have negative space doesn't always mean that it's good negative space. And we'll take a look at busy backgrounds here in a little bit. Another thing that you'll see in photography is the idea of a vignette. And a vignette is the darkening of the edges around here. And so we're using that to kind of funnel our eye to the subject. So a lot of times when you have a lot of negative space, especially in portraiture, you'll vignette those edges, and that will push the eye from the outside to the subject. So we're moving from outside to inside, and this is the brightest area. In photography, your eye is always going to move to the brightest area of the image. We'll take a look at this guy outside playing the accordion, and notice this is our negative space. We have negative space all the way around our subject, and that's kind of holding him in and framing him. If we were to crop this out, so if I was to come in here and crop this guy out, we wouldn't have enough negative space. It's doing a couple things. It's throwing the weight too much over here. We call this left heavy, meaning the weight or the image balance is too far left. If it was over here, it'd be too far right. It could be on the top. It could be on the bottom. But what we don't have is enough negative space on this side to balance with this side. If we come to this last image, this is a really good image where we have a lot of negative space, but we have two issues. First, you never cut off feet or appendages, meaning at the elbows, at the wrists, at the knees. And we have way too much negative space in this. Basically, the center of the image is right here, and we have almost half the image of negative space. There's too much space up here. This too much space that we see is what we call dead space. So we would want to crop this maybe down here and eliminate the majority of this negative space, which we see as dead space in the image. All right, the next two items we're going to take a look at are image movement and image balance. We're going to start off with movement. We're going to add a little bit of balance, and then we'll probably just combine both of them. So movement is how the viewer or the eye moves through the image, and we are controlling how that eye moves through. Now in this image, we have this really long, windy road. So what does our eye do? Well, it's really close to this line, so we follow it, and we do this little zigzag through our image all the way out of the back of this image. So we're using the road to make the eye follow, go through, and then the eye comes back here and it goes through it again. And that's how we're using the image movement in this photo. Let's take a look at a different image. So in this image, our image movement is going from right to left. Well, why? Because that's the direction that everybody's moving in this image. Notice this guy, this woman on the bike, this man, this man, this man. Everybody is moving this way, and they're following the leading lines right here as we move through that image. And this is a good example of image movement working the right way. If we had one person going the other direction, now I'm not saying that one person couldn't be going the opposite direction because everybody is moving this way, but you can use that element of the person going the opposite direction to add tension to your image. So I picked this next image because it's very simple. Just about anybody could go out and photograph this. And we're using image. We got the little person on the little snow trike and they're moving through the image. In photography, you usually want your subject moving from one side through the image, all right? It could be through this way or an S-curve, but if someone's moving left to right, you always want them to move through the image. You wouldn't want this image like this. So I'm just going to use a little Photoshop trick. So we'll slide this little kid over here and we'll let it do its thing. And it didn't do the most perfect job, but here we can see now if we have this image, now the person is what we call moving through the short side of the image, meaning he's just moving from here to here. And that creates all this dead space on this side. Remember, it was negative space when our subject was over here because he's moving through the image. But when you move the image back over here, because you're moving through the short side, you're not using this negative space in the frame anymore. And we call that dead space. Take a look at this image. This is not a good photograph. First of all, it's not toned well. But if you look, this is what we call left heavy. We've got all this stuff going on the left-hand side of the image and nothing going on over here. And everybody is faced this way. We've got our leading lines moving in this direction. It could be this direction, but I think we're going to see it in this direction. She's looking this way. He's looking down. And so not really the best composition or best photo. It's a little bit tight. She could use a little more negative space on here. So this is what we call left heavy. Everything needs to shift in this direction to become a better photo. In this photo, we have two simple birds, but because we have one bird facing this direction and one bird facing this direction, we're not sure as to which direction to move through this image because this bird looks this way and this bird looks this way. Neither one is really more dominant than the other. So this causes problems for us because we do not understand how to move through this photo. If we come to this seagull, now notice this bird is on the right-hand side. It's flying from left to right, and we're moving in this direction through our photo. It's a nice, simple, clean image done really well. So I picked these next couple images just to show you how image movement or direction of a subject can affect the image. So this one's done pretty well. We've got her with her arms thrown back, and we see the movement. She's going this direction. But look at this next image when she turns her body. So now it's kind of weird. It almost looks like she's falling backwards and going to lose her balance, and she's facing the wrong way. This image seems to work so much better because we have that image movement through the photo. But in this image, the person's in the same area, almost the same lighting, but she's moving this direction or pointing that direction. It's also contradicting the movement that we see here, and it just looks strange in this photo. All right, this is one of my favorite images here to do tutorials on composition. Notice we've got our leading lines. We've got this line leading us this way. We've got this line leading us this way. All these lines leading us this way. The background is very busy. And we've got this woman on the scooter, and she's riding in that direction. So we know from the right to the left. But what are the issues? Well, the issue is, first of all, she's in the center of the frame. It lacks balance. The horizon line goes right through the center instead of on a third. And she's moving through the short side of the image, meaning we're not using any of this area here, which we see as dead space. If you're finding the information in any of these videos helpful, if you could please give me a thumbs up, that would be wonderful. If you would like to subscribe and get future videos as they come up, because I'm going to be doing a whole series on Lightroom right here, that would be great as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at this image. All in all, this isn't a bad image. We've got line movement going from the back to the front. He's looking in the same direction. The background's thrown out of focus. In my opinion, though, we don't have enough negative space above his head. If we were to click on the rule of thirds, you can see that his eye level probably should be around here, not up around there. Really, what we would need to do is shoot a little bit looser and have a little bit more negative space up here on the top. And that would give us a little bit better image balance within this photo. And you'd be surprised, usually if you crop something really tight here, you don't want something really tight up top. You're almost better off cutting off the top of someone's head so that they go off here, off here. It doesn't work so great in this image, but a lot of times, don't be afraid to chop something off at the top if you chop it off at the bottom. Here's the image of this woman that we saw earlier. Notice that we have a little bit of negative space. I think it's a little bit loose, meaning there's a little bit too much negative space. So we're going to change the balance of this image. We're going to come in here in the side and we will shift her, I think, a little bit more towards the center so that we're using something like the golden ratio right here. We take a look at that golden ratio. And now I've got there, we're kind of throwing her in a little bit on that image. I can come up, I think. And that's probably how I would crop this image. I'm trying to balance the subject within this space. If we take a look at this image, notice our horizon line is in the center. We've got this vertical movement here of her body, but then her arms are going this way. This is what we call contradictory image movement, where we've got lines going this way and lines going this way. I don't think it's horrible in this image, but I think it could be done. I understand why they're doing what they're doing. We also have a little bit too much negative space. So if we wanted to try to change the image balance here, we could come way in and notice that we've got this third of the sky, 2/3 here, and we've got our subject closer to this third moving this way. Remember, they don't have to be exactly on the crosshairs. I'm looking at this line. So we can crop this, and here's our image movement. So she's looking this way and this way. I think this is a little bit cleaner image and something that I would like better. Is it perfect? No. All right, and the last thing that we're going to take a look at are backgrounds. And backgrounds are what ruins most people's photos. Everyone pays so much attention to what the subject is doing, they have no idea what's going on behind our subject. So let's take a look at these few random images that I found here. So notice we've got a nice pole coming out of her head. We've got this ugly orange truck. We've got a stop sign, and we got a whole bunch of busyness going on with all these different textures. Plus, she's wearing a busy shirt. So there's just so much going on in this image, it makes it difficult to look at. All right, in this next image, what we're taking a look at is called high key, meaning it's very bright and very black. So it's bright and black. And what that causes a lot of visual distraction in the background. Now, you can use something being high key visually to enhance your photo, but in this case, we've got this bright area, a dark area. Bright area of the leaves because it's way overexposed, bright area, dark area, bright area, dark area. All this texture, and we're trying to look at this simple flower along this railroad track. And yeah, it's horribly busy. You need to have clean, simple images in photography. So in this image, notice we've got a spray can, we've got a beautiful trash can, two guys leaning up against some concrete there. And this is way left heavy. There's just too much going on in this image to be visually interesting. Another good example of a telephone or light pole. These are probably the first things that you learn as a beginning student. Do not have telephone lines, telephone poles, or any poles shooting out of the backs of people's heads. In this image, notice we've got this bright area. Remember, the eye goes to the brightest part of the image. Well, if our background is severely overexposed, we're going to look right past him and look at this back area. Do we need to see any of this? No. First of all, it's got too much texture. Place yourself in a location where your background is clean and simple, but not busy like it is in this situation. Well, that's it for this video on composition. Hopefully you learned a little bit, and take one step at a time. Don't try to apply every rule that you learned today. Just use one and then add another once you figure that out, and then add another and add another. And all of this will dramatically improve the quality of your imagery.